in that area.
Yeah. So the New York Times,
That gives,
you see the New York Times?
gives the Rita homes and everything, that's just a.
They had a arrest fire and all kind
I had some, a long letter from the customer park that said that customer paid over $100,000 to fix what was the letters. They might read us letters. So, interesting.
We got a forum, you go.
Sure.
I don't have any messages from him.
All right, good morning, everybody. For those that are here up in this snowy morning, welcome to our Monday, March 7th City Council work session. This morning we're going to work on stream buffer ordinance and also procurement ordinance changes. So, Mr. Manager, I'll quickly kick it over to you and let's get going.
Actually, I don't have a whole lot to say. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Jonathan.
Good morning, Mayor, members of council. Jonathan Gano, Public Works Director. I see this presentation here, but not on the main screen. Is Kay back there? Is Kay listening, maybe?
There we go.
We got it.
I don't know, we didn't get that, you didn't send this out. I don't think we received this, did we? I didn't. Okay.
So what we have for discussion this morning is presenting to you all the combined consensus work product of the Walnut Creek Watershed Management Authority. Has finished a draft model ordinance, and I want to walk you through what that product is. We, as members of the Walnut Creek WMA, had a hand in shaping it, but as a model ordinance and consensus product, it's not quite what we would bring to you all for approval, but this is just acquainting you all with the concept. The WMA as a whole is seriously undertaking, the members of the WMA, of Walnut Creek WMA, are seriously considering undertaking the stream buffer ordinance as this draft product here is to their councils for consideration, and we'll walk you through what a stream buffer ordinance is and why and what it would look like for Des Moines, and then also zoom in on some neighborhoods to see how it might impact both present, past, and future development. So the first thing is that, I'll just use the arrow key. So the stream buffers provide a whole host of benefits. We know that the creek is more than just where the creek currently is, because water will move over time in a way that is incredibly difficult to manage. We have 21 miles of levees in downtown Des Moines to contain the river to where the river goes now, but that's simply not practical to do over the 200 miles of creekway that run through the rest of the city. And as water moves over time, it's going to go pretty far and wide in the space that Mother Nature has provided for it. And that can happen not just on the big rivers, but even on the small ones too. This is an example of very carefully documented meandering of a stream on a 100-mile watershed that's smaller than 4 Mile Creek. So even over the course of a couple decades, a stream that's as small as 4 Mile Creek will move quite substantially over time. You see the oldest date there is 1924. We've got a lot of development in Des Moines that is older than 1924 and would expect to see this much meandering, if not more, on even some of our what we would consider medium-sized streams. So the idea of the buffer is to limit what can happen when that water moves. If you have a stream out in the middle of nowhere, it's like the tree falling in the woods. Does anyone hear it? We don't really care quite as much, except when our yards start backing up to those properties and we start seeing instabilities develop, erosion continues. Anytime you see a 1 foot or more sheer face of earth next to a body of water, it's going to get bigger. That's an instability, and erosion and natural processes will continue to erode that away.
Is that picture of the city of Des Moines?
No, that was from North Carolina. All right, just example pictures. This one is not either, thankfully. But when you've got that much water and that much instability right next to a house, you've got a big problem. So this is going to take some real engineering to fix that one there. But not only do you start impacting properties, but when you started pushing properties and land development activities closer to the creek, you start limiting your options for stream bank stabilization. So here I mentioned the 1 foot or more sheer cliffs next to a waterway is a bad idea. As you start laying that out and stabilizing it, you create more space for the water to safely make its way down and stop eroding and stop delivering sediment. But when you have land development activities closer to these waterways, you start severely limiting your options that are available to you for stream bank stabilization. That tends to increase the cost or just make it very difficult at all. So we want to try to preserve that space in future developments and make a way that might help prevent some of the worst problems that from happening and preserve the toolkit available to us and to the private property owner to keep their property in safe in a safe and enjoyable manner, because a lot of this is easily foreseeable if you put if the engineering is done properly on the very front end of development. So the purpose of the stream buffer ordinance is to prevent situations like this. These are situations to be avoided. You see the gentleman down in the creekway there, large sloughing off of that stream bed. It is now wider and deeper than it was, I'm sure, when that house was built. But that's the natural progression of erosion. We also want to keep. No, this is, these are all again, examples. There are examples like this in some of the western suburbs in Clive and elsewhere. These are just
Okay.
examples. Yeah,
I got you.
so there are existing stream buffer ordinances across the metro. This was not part of the Capitol Crossroads Stormwater Management Ordinance that we brought to you all for approval back in November. That's now in effect. There was not consensus at the time to fold this in. Part of the reason is because there are multiple existing stream buffers and they don't all agree with each other. So the Walnut Creek WMA member communities undertook this as a separate and follow-up activity. We're a member of that WMA, so we wanted to participate and then bring this back for separate consideration later. So you see multiple references to type 1, type 2, type 3, and the buffer sizes that go with it. Basically, the bigger the stream, the bigger the buffer. And then there's different ways that buffer is calculated depending on where you live, and what is permissible differs based on the size of the stream in the existing stream buffer ordinances. Yeah.
Maintenance access. Could you just describe a little bit about what that entails? For Bondurant in the second bullet, additional maintenance access. What?
So the maintenance access would be, what's prohibited in the stream buffer is land development activities, which is a more stringent standard than floodplain management. Floodplain regulation basically limits inhabitable structures. So you can build a shed in the creekway, but a maintenance access would make that accessible beyond just the bare minimum of the buffer.
Accessible to
a vehicle or to a person walking. So it would preclude the placement of a structure or an object that would
okay.
make maintenance impossible.
Okay, thanks.
Or more difficult.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In some of the pictures you showed, like the before and after, like there was like reconstruction of the banks and everything like that. So would a stream buffer ordinance include us doing that work, or is it just saying we're not going to build?
Not necessarily. The stream buffer ordinance would prohibit land development activity within the buffer. Part of the problem with encroachment into that is it makes stream bank stabilization more difficult to do and limits your options. So it's showing examples of before and afters of unstable banks, and oftentimes you get things right up against a creek bed, and we have sheds and garages where the cliff face keeps eroding in. An example of why that's a bad idea is that the way to stabilize a situation where you've got the sheer cliff advancing is to do land grading that will steepen, or take the slope out of that and slope it back. But if you've got a garage right where you need to put a slope,
Then you can't do
it's
that.
now much more difficult or more expensive, and you've now made the preferred tool for solving all of that erosion and stabilizing that entire creekway a lot more difficult, or if not entirely impractical.
Okay, so we're saying if we're not building in this area, then we can do stabilization when we need to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it preserves options.
Thank
you. So as I said, this is the product of the members of the Walnut Creek WMA. Clive, Johnston, and Waukee are currently considering the adoption of the model ordinance with the typical municipal, each municipality takes its tweaks. But this would be something that would be largely similar to the rest of each of the communities would be largely similar, so that the development community and the residents are all playing by the same rules. So what we're proposing in this is 3 different kinds of buffers based on the size of the stream, which is driven by the size of the watershed and its contributory area. So the type 1 stream is what we're all familiar with. That's our 4 Mile Creek. That's Walnut Creek, Middle Creek of the North River along the south side, Frank Creek coming away from the airport. These are your larger waterways that have a defined floodway and are mapped by FEMA and all on the flood insurance rate maps. The next level up from that is the type 2. So those are the ones that show up on the USGS map. The last layer, type 3, starts at 50-acre watersheds or larger at the top of a watershed, and I'll show you an example of some cases where you see, so a 40-acre parcel at the top of a watershed with no throughput will not have a stream buffer apply to it. So 50 acres or larger, based on our analysis of aerial and topo maps. So inside the city, that looks like this. We've got the red ones are the major creeks that will be the type 1s and would have the largest and most restrictive of the stream buffers. Yater Creek across the south side is a type 2 stream, and then you got a whole bunch of type 2 out there. There's 200 miles of creekway inside the city that using the type 1, 2, and 3 method would only apply to 100 miles of those things. So half of the waterways are smaller than type 3 and would not have any stream buffers apply to them. But anywhere you see the red, the orange, and the green would be subject to some kind of restrictions on land development and what could happen inside the buffer. Not including the development reserve in the southeast corner of town, there's 17 miles of stream bank that are currently undeveloped, and this would apply to from day one at the point of initial land development were this to be adopted.
What about existing homes that are already in the buffer? What are we going to do with those?
Well, this would not apply to streams to current activity that's already been done. So it would only apply to new land development activities. For the most part, that's going to be trying to build a pool or a new garage or a new shed. That would be limited. If there is I guess a legal non-conforming use would be the term, that would continue to be allowed in the stream buffer.
Okay.
So that first layer there it defines that the area to be protected is the floodway, not the whole floodplain, just the floodway. That's the flat part of the creek the creek bed adjacent to the creek itself, plus another 50 feet. And land development activities inside that, and that is kind of a common sense understanding of where you absolutely don't want to put something. That's the flat ground right next to the creek where all the meander takes place. So you really don't want to put anything there. This would prohibit any land development activity, which would include clearing and grubbing and cutting down of trees and turning it into turf. So we want to preserve that in the most natural state possible. That's the, you'll see here, the floodway is that flat part, as I said, next to the stream channel. So you can currently, the Chapter 50 floodplain ordinance limits development inside that 1% annual chance floodplain. The floodplain includes the banks. The stream buffer does not necessarily include the banks because it's measured 50 feet out. So it will go up the slope depending on how steep your slope is, 50 feet beyond the floodway. And this is different from, but layered on top of the Chapter 50 ordinance for floodplain development because that's a vertical limitation from the 1% annual floodplain, whereas the stream buffer is a 50-foot lateral beyond the floodway. And this helps preserve those banks and keep them stable so that they can do their job and resist the erosive effects of the meandering of the stream inside that area. And this is limited to just a few of those red streams that were shown on the map there, which is 4 Mile Creek, Frink Creek, which is largely undeveloped, Middle Creek of the North River, way south, and interestingly, it's the 7th Ward ditch as it turns into the Leetown Creekway box culvert and then opens back up. It's running through the east side of town.
Can you explain the floodplain, the vertical, what you said? I didn't really.
Oh, yeah, the 1% annual chance floodplain there, it has an existing limitation for development of inhabitable structures and some other things based on vertical elevation. The finished floor of a building must be
At a certain height.
at a certain height above the base flood elevation, the dotted line shown there.
Okay.
So that tends to get you further away. It just depends on the topography. This would set a hard 50-foot buffer from the floodway, the white line of the floodway, stretching out horizontally. So the two would work together to keep land development sufficiently high to protect it from floodwater and sufficiently far away to protect the vegetated natural state of the creek bank and the adjacent areas.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're taking 50 more feet from the farthest white line from the floodway fringe?
Yeah, and I'll show you what that looks like in most cases. In almost every case, that's a one-to-one, there's an overlap. The floodplain is larger than the 50 feet.
It's not the furthest white line, it's the.
Yeah, the inside white line.
Yeah. So this
Okay.
So this
Yeah.
50
That-
feet.
Okay.
Yeah,
So this is already 50 feet here?
could,
or no?
in most cases,
The
yes.
illustration, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll have some example maps to see what that looks like here. But it does further restrict what can happen inside that 50-foot buffer, inside that floodway, or adjacent to the floodway and the floodway itself, by preventing all land development activity. Some of that is permitted now under the floodplain ordinance, as long as your finished floor of your occupied structure is high enough. We presently permit a lot more activities in that riparian space than a stream buffer ordinance was. This really fences off from land development, future land development activity, anything in that buffer space. So on the smaller streams where there's not FEMA flood maps, we have to start drawing lines in the map and using what meandering of the stream there is to try to define a belt, and we'll add a 50-foot buffer beyond where the creek is already meandering. And this is a less of a hammerlock on land development activity. It's just limited to the maximum extent practicable. So it gives some flexibility to the permitting team to consider the unique circumstances of every individual situation there. This is a smaller creek. It is, though it includes up to Yater Creek running across the south side. So you can have some substantial waterways that get some substantial water that we still want to protect. And this provides a way to define where that is in a defensible manner, and then also fence that off from land development activity. Not in a categorical exclusion, but in a way that just says, let's keep it to a bare minimum. And then your smallest of streams will just take the center line and a 25-foot measurement on each side, just drawn on the map. And this is less solid of a restriction, where it's not recommended but may be permitted, where the entire stormwater system is designed to, and the key word here is stable, a stable conveyance system. And that means anywhere you see that 1 foot of sheer face or more, it's not stable, and we would want to try to slope that back. And using that 25 feet of buffer space there preserves the ability to do that. So it would take some actual forethought to permit, to design a system that would be permitted to encroach in this buffer space. But by and large, if you're going to get a stable conveyance system, you need that 25 feet on each side of the center line anyway. So there are, like a lot of things, a whole host of what would be considered exempt activities, including a lot of repair and maintenance of existing land, construction of recreational stuff, the usual permissible things. The riparian space, especially along those type 1 streams, is excellent as a recreational resource. So we would want to permit clearing and grubbing of trees for our own and other agencies to come in and pave a trail through there. It's a great way to also use those spaces for recreation. It's one of the few things you can do in the floodplain that is exceptionally beneficial. So we do have, as written, and this will take a little bit of what I see as kind of the arm wrestling of how do we customize this model ordinance to Des Moines. The model ordinance as written says that the council may grant exceptions to parcels platted prior to the ordinance if the encroachment into the stream is unavoidable. We'll need to sort that out. Is that something that staff can approve? Is it a P&Z, Board of Appeals approval, or is it council approval, or is it just no, we don't really want anything going on there? The customization of the draft ordinance is all of 5 pages long, and 3 of those pages are definitions. So there's a lot of work still yet to do to make this fit into and comply with all of the other things that Des Moines would need to do were we to want to undertake this. But there is, even at the model ordinance stage, baked in a way to provide exceptions especially for properties that have been platted prior to the adoption of this ordinance.
How many are those? How many are we talking about? Do you know
How many properties?
that are plotted already prior to this ordinance?
Only 17 miles of our 200 miles remain unplatted as undeveloped. So this would apply to the overwhelming majority of the 200 miles of creekway. Though this would only apply to 100 miles. So of the 100 miles that this would apply to, only 17 would be approaching this with fresh eyes. The remaining 80, 90 would need to look at what's avoidable and what's not avoidable. And then there's baked in a way, if it's unavoidable, then exceptions can certainly be granted.
So you're saying over 80 miles is already plotted of parcels? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why we didn't really push this in the Capitol Crossroads stormwater thing, because it's not a great fit for Des Moines. For the western suburbs that are most interested in this, Walnut Creek, it's a lot of development going out there, and they're more motivated to pursue preserving those buffers so that they don't get the same. There's multiple places in Clive in the western suburbs that have those 8-foot tall cliffs where the creek is marching closer and closer to homes. We don't have a lot of that. So we were not, and then you have on the eastern side of the metro 3 ordinances already existing. So there was not consensus amongst the communities to do this at that time. And most of Des Moines is already built out. So this would only apply on a fresh basis at the plating stage to those properties in those 17 miles.
So those properties in Three Lakes Estates that we had to purchase, that were sliding into the, would they have been allowed to be built where they were built?
Probably so. The problem there wasn't a close proximity to the waterway, it was the way that the slopes were built. If I remember right, that they were either too steep or the soil wasn't backfilled correctly. I forget the exact details, but it was not because of the proximity to the lake, but in order to do the rehab on the lake, we had to take them out because we couldn't do both.
Okay.
Preserve. Yeah, I think it was an unsuitable backfill would be what I would, if I remember right, would be the proximate cause of the problem.
Can you clarify something for me? So there's 17 miles of undeveloped that this would, like, it would just be set in stone, like you can't build. But then you said there were like 200 some miles that were already platted, and then but 100 this would apply to?
Sorry, there's citywide, there's 200 miles of creekway. Of that 200, only 100 would this apply to.
This buffer ordinance?
The buffer ordinance, yes, because the creek, the watersheds aren't big enough in the other 100 miles to qualify. So the
So it's not
waterways,
even a type 3?
the waterways are not type 3. Yeah, they're type 4 if we need to set a type.
Okay.
Of the type 1, 2, and 3 waterways, that's 100 miles. And of those 100 miles, only 17 remain undeveloped.
Okay, the rest are platted and developed?
Yeah.
Okay, so then on like 100 miles, we are granting exceptions every time somebody wants to build a garage or something?
85-ish,
85 miles?
85, 90, yeah. Whatever 103 minus 17 is.
83.
Drawing a blank on
83.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
So there is, this would not obviate the current and established practice of the city to require maintenance of the stream bed and the creekway by the property owner. It is, so that this is something that we would still want the property owner to be responsible for, but by precluding land development activity in that space, we preserve their options, either for the property owner to undertake through or we can assist through the Stormwater Rebate program, or we can, as we did along Yater Creek, for water quality at Easter Lake purposes, undertake stream bank stabilization on their property for the collective behalf.
So who will oversee, it said that management's up to the private owner, if the homeowner, who, do our inspectors go out and inspect that they've cleaned it up? Because it said they should maintain it, clean it.
That would likely be enforced on a complaint basis. Typically, when we get the phone call about, hey, the creek bed is going to take out my garage, is when we find out that a creekway is eroding in a way that's going to endanger people or property. But we do have, this would include the right to inspect, so that's this
Okay.
next slide here, that there's a way to fold that in and go, proactively go look at things. But I want to draw your attention to how this would, let's roll the calendar back 25 years and see how this might have applied to a neighborhood with notable stormwater concerns. Brook Run here has multiple type 2 and type 3 streams inside of it. And if we were to draw the buffers on top of those, 50-foot and 25-foot, they would look about like that. And we see 87 properties are affected by that buffer space. And in 15 of those 87 cases, there is a house inside the buffer space, which is maybe a little closer than I would like my house to be, to an advancing and eroding creek. So this would, a stream buffer ordinance applied to this neighborhood would have bumped those houses further away from the creek at the very beginning. And the way to accommodate this would be to at the time of platting, to flex the streets and the houses around the buffer space when all you're doing is moving lines on a map inside a computer drawing program to allow the development to accommodate the future movement of that stream. Erosion is a natural process. It will continue to progress. We want to stabilize that and minimize the advancement. Human development and activity and our uses of the land exacerbate it noticeably. But it's a natural process, and we want to allow, to the greatest extent possible, the water to go where it's going to go. That's by far the cheapest and easiest way to manage the interface of people with their water.
So, and just to be clear, 25 years ago, nobody ever imagined that there would be the erosion that's there today. I mean, I clearly remember being involved in building houses, and I could walk right down, and the toddlers would just walk right out into the little stream there and get their feet wet. But with the weather changing the way it has, and our events that we've had, this is a completely different picture today than what it was 25 years ago.
Yeah, we do.
So-
We have had more frequent and more intense rainstorms delivered. The average intensity is increasing and accelerating over the last 20 years.
So it's not like the developer, did something wrong at that time. That was the practice 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So,
But who pays for that today?
Homeowners.
All of these spots on the map, we're anticipating there could be issues there over time. Like, are we?
Yeah, some of these have already had a substantial amount of work
There's
done.
already
Down at the bottom of that map there, I want to say 10 to 15 years ago, there was a joint project with the city in Polk County, mostly Polk County, doing a lot of stone riprap to stabilize that creek bed at the bottom of that watershed.
Right,
This is
so we're trying to avoid a repeat of those problems in new development, and that's part of the purpose of
Yep.
this.
Where Scott and Steve Neighbor.
Do we, as erosion goes on, I guess, what are you predicting, how long is it going to take before this 50 feet on either side isn't good enough?
I'm sorry, was
How long is it going to take before 50 feet isn't good enough if we're dealing with natural process of erosion? Hundreds of years or?
Probably right.
I don't know the answer to that. How long it would take to, it really depends on how much the stream moves, because under this definition, especially the type 2, we're using the creekway to define to draw that belt. So it will continue to move, and the belt will get wider. At least at the time of platting, you've got 50 feet where the meander is currently inside of. I wouldn't expect in a generation or two that it's going to move all 50 feet. But at the very least, you're now 50 feet, any structure or land development activity is now 50 feet away from the outside, the outermost edge of that stream. You've got quite a ways to go.
Okay, so we're not worried about, a natural process of erosion and the situation has changed from what we set it as. We're saying that we have that extra space and so we should be good for the lifetime of the house, basically.
I would expect so.
Okay, cool.
And if not, you could say could you go ahead and say, hey, in a long time, start putting more buffer material and things like that in there?
Yeah, you can, if you're particularly, the place I would be most concerned about would be at the curve of the meander where that 50-foot boundary starts. It could continue to erode in there. You would want to stabilize that and stop that erosion from continuing closer to one's property. It would then meander elsewhere, but you could at least stop that with some stabilization there. By preserving that 50-foot space, you can lower the grade there and stabilize it so you don't have that unstable cliff that will just continue eroding.
And you said the measurement was taken at the time of development.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so people know, the neighborhood, the city, and the county are all working together on a couple of projects right here. There's an application in through the IFA. Any word on that? Do you think we'll hear pretty soon?
I've not
Patrick?
heard anything. Patrick, have you?
Probably will get an answer soon. I don't know the exact timing of it.
So,
Okay, I know the neighborhood has asked me too, and it's I don't know.
Have not heard back
Okay.
on its prospects.
So in the end of the day, we are paying for some of the restoration.
No.
We have, in this neighborhood, depending on where you live in the city, the Stormwater Rebate Program will pay 50, 75, or 100% of the first 4,000, I keep hitting that, sorry. 50, 75, or 100% of the first $4,000 of work that a property owner does on a reimbursement basis. So they do have to front the cash, and then we'll pay them back.
But this is a grant that they've applied for, and then the neighborhood association will be responsible for like a third, so they have to put in 50,000 if they get this grant, correct, Patrick?
It's going to be shared funds that
Yeah,
are
it's good.
completing this project between the IFA grant, the city kicking in the stormwater rebate funds,
Right.
and then the residents putting in.
Right, and I think the city maybe has to manage it or something, or I think we've worked it out, maybe the county's going to manage it.
Oh, the question about fiscal agency.
Yeah.
Yeah, on behalf of to do the fiscal agency on behalf of the homeowners association, yeah. So in addition to the 15 houses that are inside the buffer, there's 13 more properties that have decks, patios, or retaining walls, and these would be land development activities that would be limited to the maximum extent practicable on these green streams. So not an outright prohibition on the green streams in the buffer space, so there is the possibility to use that. But we would want to limit it to the maximum extent practicable. So there are existing conflicts with homes and appurtenance structures and other uses inside that space.
So going forward, if a particular parcel like this would come in front of the city, would we be able to put that many houses now on that parcel? Or there would
In
be
this
no way?
space here, we haven't looked at how you might flex the streets around, but you could adjust where the streets are. You might lose a couple lots out of it, but not I wouldn't think a whole lot.
These are really deep backyards.
Yeah, between Village Run Drive and I think that's Parkside Drive, I think that could have been designed differently without losing any lot.
I just wondered, I mean.
At the bottom of that watershed there where Streamside Circle is,
Yeah.
and I think that's Hull, those are really short lots, and they're really close to that stream, which is why that stream bank stabilization 10 years ago took place just a few years after the neighborhood was developed. The yard started eroding in a way that I think each of those homeowners kicked in $5,000 or $10,000 each to participate in stream bank stabilization with Polk County. To get all that hard armored and just hold it where it is for a generation or two. That's probably where you'd lose some ability to develop, but it's questionable as to whether or not, if you got to put $5 or $10 grand into stream bank stabilization less than a generation after your home has been developed, it's too close to the creek.
Can you talk about that phrase, maximum extent practicable? I'm not sure.
Yeah, maximum extent practicable is a term that allows or allows some flexibility beyond a flat prohibition. So it would, in a type 2 stream, the land development activity would be prohibited to the maximum extent practicable. So we're trying to keep as much out of that space as we can. Where you'll likely see that with the greatest impact is on either redevelopment or permitting activities in an already platted neighborhood, where there's hard limits to what's possible because the property lines are there, the houses are there. We would want to preserve that space as much as we can, but not to the same level of importance as a larger stream where it's just not permitted at all.
So the type
Where you
1
would-
doesn't have that exception in there?
The maximum extent practicable will be most easily applied at the greenfield development stage where it is eminently practicable to preserve that space.
Yeah.
Because all you have to do is draw boundaries on the map. It'd be like at the design stage, just like designing around setbacks for utilities, setbacks from the road, easements, and all the other considerations that go into design. This would be just another one that provides a more healthy respect for the creekway. Where maximum extent practical will be most necessary in the already developed areas will be when you've got a situation like this where there are already structures there, the lot lines are already drawn, so we're going to try to limit that as much as possible.
So what does that do in a situation where someone has like a deck that's within that yellow area, and like they wanted to do something with that? Like, if they wanted to extend it, we would say no. If they wanted to,
It would really depend on that is really a case-by-case situation.
okay,
And that's something that can be written into the ordinance for guidance level, but maximum extent practical affords both the property owner some leeway, and it affords the permitting agency at the city some leeway to let the most use of the property balance against the most protection of the buffer, without either one being superior to the other.
okay. But did you say that doesn't apply for type 1? Or that still exists for type 1?
Type 1 would be well, the land development activities are straight prohibition in type 1 buffer space, and that will be at the new development stage most easily accommodated and not something that would be negotiable. At the redevelopment or existing plat, that's why I drew attention to the exception that council may grant, at least as written in the draft ordinance. The writers of it wanted the council to approve exceptions to existing plats where it's unavoidable, but it would be, there you're looking at exceptions are possible only where they're unavoidable.
For type 1, 2, and 3?
That would be, well, yeah, and
Okay.
that would be for type 1, 2, and 3
Okay.
for already existing plats.
Okay, thank you.
So I just zooming in a bit on those examples where you can see the creek highlighted, the buffer space, the homes are overlapping, and we're well inside that buffer space, uncomfortably so on a couple of those properties. Another example on the south side, this is Southwestern Hills, just south of Park.
Could you go back to that last slide? So are these, I mean, I know it's in this context of this particular ordinance, but when we get a really heavy rain, if we were to guess properties that are going to be impacted in the future by that heavy rain, it's probably the same properties as well, right?
Yeah, and as something designed in the 90s, got built at the end of the 90s for, sizing infrastructure, and we consider this natural infrastructure, it might have been adequate in the 90s, but I don't think it will remain adequate or will offer the same level of protection in an ongoing manner in the future.
But to give those homes that are there now some reassurance, as we redevelop Douglas Avenue, we are putting in 2 storm basins that
Yeah.
we hope will hold some of that water, at least slow it down there, and it won't be directly impacted on these homes like it has in the past.
Yeah, this is another tool in the toolkit for resiliency, building storage and upstream,
Right.
particularly as properties develop, but where necessary, tucking it in the middle of a watershed
I think we have
helps build our ability to slow down that
basins?
erosion and hold the water
two or three, 2 basins.
on the 2 main stems that come through, the 2 type 2 streams.
Well, and plus, as a for instance, the work that was done off of 47th, around Hickman and Holcomb and.
Yeah,
whatever.
now that one's at the top of a watershed, not only protecting itself, but also properties downstream, where we're just now, 4 years later, getting a bigger pipe up to it over the next year and a half or so. So building
And-
conveyance, that's an already developed neighborhood where we've taken the creek and put it in a pipe. And where we still have those creeks, we'd like to preserve that volume and the space to let the water fill up and go back down without eroding into people's backyards.
Right, in the extremes that we saw, 2018, that created that situation, that kind of an extreme seems to be more frequent.
Yeah, that is in fact
So-
the case. More frequent, more intense, more of our rainfall is falling in fewer and larger events. kind of like our snow was this year. Yeah. Yeah, we had a couple inches, all show up all at once,
Just saying that.
both
They-
before and after the tornado and the hailstorm.
Right.
Right. That was pretty extreme.
Couple inches are interesting along with the wind, Joe, but not like the 10 that we saw in 2018
Yeah.
in 3 hours.
But that one's really impacted.
So another example showing an even earlier decades of development with, that almost entirely disregarded the flow of the natural stream. But we've got 100 lots touching the buffer. 25 of those homes are in the buffer entirely, so inadvisable. Another 11 properties with some sort of permitted structure inside the buffer space. And zooming in a bit so you can see, there's a home that's, well, it's where the bottom left one, that's, the entire home is inside the buffer space. And were we to get a 10-inch rain, it would come right across through there and fill up their basement. They piped underneath the drive to make that lot developable, but if were this to be repeated now with a buffer on that, you can tell it was an infill lot, you could just bump the house back behind the buffer space. And again, this is a type 2 stream, so maximum extent practicable. You could, exceptions could be made to permit the driveway to be put in, a box culvert of sufficient size, instead of the couple hundred feet of pipe that looks like is dropped in there now. But this gives the ability to let the water go where it wants to go without threatening future properties. Not had a whole lot of complaints in these areas, so maybe the stream is more stable. As far as recently or to be developed land, we have, this is Middle Creek of the North River down, visible from Highway 5. That's Fleur Drive there, running north and south through the center. We see type 1, type 2, and type 3 streams there. And what I want to draw your attention to is where you see the orange lines and the green lines, you also currently see trees. So this is where we would want the buffer to go is already riparian space that is natural. The land around it, the flat ground, is what's being farmed, but the creekway of type 2 and type 3 creeks are not being farmed now, and were a buffer placed on top of them, it would largely be preserving existing trees and existing natural vegetation areas, and the development would cooperate around that instead of trying to make the creek fit around the development. So if we were to drop this is showing where that 50-foot line would sit on the floodway. The red hash mark space is the floodway. That's the bottom of the creek adjacent to the waterway. The blue light space is the 100-year floodplain. That's going to be when the banks get full, that's where the water will be. So in almost every case, the red stripe is where the 50-foot past the floodway would get you that far up the banks. And almost everywhere you see the buffer is inside the 100-year floodplain. So that gets you the benefit of a flat prohibition of land development activity in the floodway and that 50-foot space adjacent to it. And then on top of that, you've got the Chapter 50 floodplain limitations on inhabitable space in the light blue, hazy light blue area. And then drawing additional buffer space in there, which, as you see, as a type 2 stream comes into the 100-year floodplain, it gets bigger there because of backwater effects from the main water body there. So you already have prohibitions on development of the highest intense development in many of these places already, and the stream buffer would cooperate with existing floodplain regulations in a way that helps preserve the banks and keep them naturally vegetated and therefore more stable and able to resist the meandering of those waterways on into the future. So we're not adding on another 50 feet. It's almost entirely contained within the existing 100-year floodplain. And, yeah, just zooming in, excuse me, a little closer to see what that would look like in some of those places there. So the next steps would be to get solicit feedback from you all if you have thoughts about this concept or the specifics of how exceptions might apply. We are still arm wrestling amongst city departments what that language would look like. We have a finished product from the Walnut Creek WMA. We did help write it, but there's a lot to deconflict with existing ordinances and other approval processes, and at what level what different things get approved at is still to be determined. Subject to any questions, that's all I have.
Anybody have anything?
I guess I'm just wondering how we feel about the exception piece and like who should be determining that. Like, should it be just a straight council exception? Should it go through someone before it gets to council and needs to be appealed, or like?
I think the expertise is with staff. Obviously, if we can't agree upon it with staff, and there's some other kinds of circumstances, then I would think they would have an opportunity maybe to come to us at that point, but I think staff is the expert in it. I mean, I'm far from an expert to say where someone can build their house and where they can't.
Well, and where does it, and under what circumstance does it go to zoning board of adjustment, or does it come through P and Z and then end up on our table to say yea or nay, or, I mean, I think that may be what.
I'll take this as feedback that three of you all have very strong questions about how that should look like. We as staff haven't settled on a best course of action either, so that will be our next steps, is figuring out what that looks like and sorting out. Some things are in the code are not really appealable, like floodplain development is not something that exceptions are made for. So the degree to which this impacts existing properties is something that we still need to wrestle with, and how to make, what kind of recourse is available to property owners that this might negatively impact.
Yeah, so if one of these houses would catch fire, or have some type of tragic tornado or whatever, are we going to allow them to rebuild in some of those spots in Brook Run?
Yeah, by and large, I would think that the purpose of this is to fence off mostly from future development. So not seeking to penalize existing property owners for a home that was legally built in whatever decade it was. Okay. I would imagine we would want to prohibit them from doing maybe an expansion of that home into the buffer space. But even if a home got knocked out by a tornado, we would not want to orphan that lot. Okay. And the home from repairs. We do have thresholds for floodplain redevelopment, where if more than 50% of the home is damaged, it's not rebuildable. I don't know that this would apply in that same way. The balance of property rights versus environmental protection here is a different equation than the floodplain one, which is also protecting human life by getting occupied space out of the floodplain as a demonstrable public good. So I don't know that we want the same level of just a flat prohibition with no appeal like we do for floodplain ordinances. So we'll puzzle through what that looks like and bring it back.
That could be a potential problem.
Yeah, yeah. With only 17 miles of our 107,
that's
looking at the Greenfield map, this will mostly apply to existing creekways, and we want to puzzle through what avenues are available to property owners so that we don't abandon, we don't orphan a property is kind of how that.
Even the whole more than 50% is destroyed, and we're not going to allow them to rebuild it. I understand why, but I don't know how, banks or insurance companies even would be able to insure.
Yeah, the point of this is not to punish property owners that happen to have an unfortunate location for a structure that was legally built at the time. Okay. And I'll certainly want to consult with the legal department, but I think the way to do that is grandfathering, just writing in a grandfathering clause. But we still want to limit some land development activity on those lots.
I understand that.
How we write the language is important.
So whether it be the deck or the pool.
Yeah, no, I understand all of that, but
You don't want those folks building in addition.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you 100% with that, but if you're going to say that 50% of their house is destroyed by a natural disaster, and then say you're not going to build there, yeah, we're going to have potential problems with
Oh,
that.
yeah, yeah. I think that may be the case only with floodplains, so you don't have repeat loss, flood insurance claims.
What if the natural disaster is?
It's the flood.
water coming through? I mean, I think we want to learn a lesson from that too, but, I mean, if that happens, a future council is going to be asked to deal with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I
So my
understand that point also. But
first bullet point there is get feedback from council. That first thing that I gather from you all is, what do we do about, one, existing properties, and where do you want appeals or exceptions to be decision-making authority to reside, and under what circumstances, and grandfathering?
When it comes to like the rebuilding piece, I mean, just one of the lots that we looked at, like it was like half of the lot was in the, that area, but it was the house half when they had like a whole backyard. And like, I'm wondering if it could be like a discussion at that point to say like, you can rebuild the house, but like you probably should build it back. And then like the exception would be granted through that. I don't know. Like just saying like, having the conversation of like, what's a better way to rebuild this so it's less dangerous, especially if that's a situation where it's like it floods and that's why the house was destroyed. I just wanted to put that on the table.
Scott, you want to make a couple comments?
Yeah, actually, due to time, and I do want to get this next topic in, I want to make sure we're hearing from council that you want us to pursue this, because at a high level, it's meant to be more intuitive than what we already have on the books, which is that 100-year, 1% that you hear about, height of the water volume, if you will. This is going to be more intuitive when you know that there's a stream bank within the property to stay back the 50 feet or the 25 feet, whatever is appropriate. So we can work through some recommendations on how the details would get worked out and bring that back at the next phase. We did not want to spend that time if there wasn't an interest by the council. So we will bring this back when it has more detail to discuss. Sound good?
Other questions?
yeah, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that.
Jonathan,
Thank
thank you. Let's move on to our procurement ordinance changes.
Okay.
You'll send us this, will you send this out to us?
The presentation.
The presentation.
Oh, yeah.
All right, thanks. I did not get it. Did you get it?
I don't know, I got, it was too large to scan that.
Okay.
I put a lot of pictures in, sorry.
Thank you.
It was a huge file.
I want to look at one of those pictures.
And then the procurement one we just got, he just finished
So-
it up, so you didn't get that either,
Mayor and council will have Nick and James come forward on the next topic.
the presentation.
We've got procurement ordinance, and there are elements to our procurement ordinance that council has requested that we would bring back and discuss. There are, as you might imagine, when we dig into a procurement review, we find other opportunities to make improvements. And so there are several different elements that we are looking to either expand upon within the existing procurement or actually add into it. But another goal that we have is to simplify that ordinance. And similar to other discussions we've had with council, we want to establish a two-tiered system, if you will, of what the ordinance lays out at the highest level with the council authority, and then actually have a standard operating procedures policy that you'll hear finance staff talk about that is able to change with best practices in a more nimble way. And that is in itself a best practice in setting up a layered approach of an ordinance and then a policy that is more flexible. So with that, I will turn it over to James and let him introduce himself as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Scott. As Scott mentioned, my name is James Remington, Deputy Finance Director with the city, over the accounting, procurement, risk management, and treasury divisions. And obviously today we're mostly addressing the procurement division here. As Scott mentioned, this is sort of an overview slideshow, similar to what Jonathan just presented, in that we have an ordinance that we're working on, which was actually sent out to council last week late. But we're not going to dive into all of the details necessarily, just sort of give an overview of the thought process, what we're trying to accomplish, and sort of why we're trying to accomplish it. So in order to start off, I want to sort of set a baseline for what we're talking about exactly, which is the procurement process, which I like to think of as the how to the budget process is what, right? So you're finishing up the budget process for fiscal '23 here, and essentially what you're doing there is setting the direction that the city's going to go in, what we're going to spend our money on, and sort of how it's all parsed out across the different departments. And the procurement process sort of comes in on the back end of that and dictates the how we go about spending that money. And it sort of follows it all the way through the process of maintaining a vendors list and going out there, setting up what the evaluation of a purchase looks like, what the bidding process looks like, so on and so forth. And generally, the process point at which council gets involved is contract award portion. So we come back to you guys and you approve whatever vendor we've selected as staff, and we move forward. But beyond that, the actual procurement process stays with that purchase throughout its lifetime, including like contract management, payment, so on and so forth. And then it's a cycle, obviously, because at some point the contract ends and the whole process starts all over again. Now, the current ordinance and the proposed ordinance both sort of cordon off a large swath of expenditures that don't fall under the procurement process. So what I've done here is essentially taken fiscal year 21 actuals and presented a pie graph of what the portions look like. So the public improvements, the blue, the payroll, the red, are both immediately looped out of the procurement process, right? Payroll is based on negotiations with employees or unions. Public improvements follows a process dictated by the state and handled by the engineering department. And then the remaining 39%, which equates to about $215 million in fiscal 21, sort of starts with the procurement process. Some of those items are specifically looped out. Some of them are looped out as they're reviewed and actually determined to be too specific to go through a whole bidding process or whatever may be required. But the point is, the procurement process is essentially going to cover in detail 20 to 25% of the city's expenditures in a given year. So where we are in the process, I became Deputy Finance Director back in late 2020, at which point I began sort of a review process over the procurement process and the procurement ordinance because from my time as a Deputy Comptroller and Risk Manager prior to that, I knew that there were some holes in the process, as I would see it, that needed to be patched or reviewed to sort of come to a better methodology of conducting our process. And part of that was right-sizing the procurement division. So historically, when I became Deputy Finance Director, the procurement division consisted of 2.5 professionals, essentially, to handle all of the city's procurement, which, as a comparison, if you look at Iowa City, they have 5 staff when we looked at it. Cedar Rapids, 5.75. And if you look at Knoxville, Tennessee, which is 190,000 population, they were sitting about 7 procurement staff. So we've buffed up the procurement division to now have 5 professionals, a little bit more in line with what we're looking to accomplish as far as controls and systems and reviews. And I'm not going to cover every point here, but essentially where we're at now is the initial draft of a redone procurement ordinance that we're interested in coming to you guys and talking about. So what did the review of the procurement ordinance tell us? Essentially, I found 3 key areas that needed improvement. And this will be broken down as efficiency, controls, and goals. And the next 3 slides will sort of cover that in detail. First, operational efficiency and best practice. As Scott mentioned, right now the procurement process is effectively captured exclusively in the ordinance. Now, an ordinance, of course, is a legal document written in legal language with terms that sometimes aren't easiest to understand in the world. So the intention overall is to sort of break apart the ordinance with the legal framework that surrounds the procurement process and separate out the detailed processes into a manual which can be written in more understandable and straightforward terms and be more adaptable as situations change. We need to be flexible. I mean, as an extreme example, obviously, the way procurement happened in the past couple of years with the COVID-19 pandemic was an extreme change for what you would see traditionally, right? Supply lines changed, the availability of products changed, so on and so forth. So having the ability to separate out the legal framework for how we conduct procurement from the detailed process would allow us greater flexibility to respond to situations like that and just generally changing environments as well. Also, being a legal document, the ordinance creates some confusion on occasion, let's say. So the example I like to talk about here is the way we conduct purchases with Menards. Menards is a great partner with the city. We spend about $200,000 on average every year with them. And every year we come to council for approval over a $125,000 blanket or thereabouts for the Public Works Department. Now, as I said, that we spend about $200,000 on average with Menards, but we only come to you for approval on $125,000. Now, essentially what's happening there is the blanket purchase order we ask you to approve is simply a procurement mechanism. It's not a contract. It's not an agreement. There aren't any terms more robust than what you or I would get just walking into Menards to buy something off the shelf. But because of the way the ordinance is written, it sort of traps that piece of paper, essentially is whatever it is, the blanket purchase order, into the process so that we come to you for approval over that. And it's further complicated because we're only coming to you for approval over the portion that Public Works is going to spend, not the portion that the city expects to spend with Menards. It's not for any specific items, it's just for generic goods and supplies. And frankly, if we changed the methodology with which we conducted that purchase to like a P card, if the staff had P card, we wouldn't even be creating that blanket purchase order. So it's sort of an example of how the ordinance creates a form over function look on things. We're following a very specified form within the ordinance, but the ultimate function is that we're just using this as a simple payment mechanism. It's a number that Menards can throw on an invoice and send to us that we can pay off of and track. So the idea there, again, shift the ordinance to admin, so to sort of a city policy level and a legal framework level, and then have a manual underneath that that sort of dictates detailed processes. The second one is controls ensure citywide cohesion. So part of the problem is that language in the ordinance and the way that it is written allows for interpretation on some things where interpretation shouldn't be allowed. The example I give here is it uses the phrase cost to the city. And we can use that phrase then to say that some funds, depending on their source, aren't an actual cost to the city. So what generally happens is, let's say we go out and we apply for a federal grant. Part of that federal grant is a requirement that we have procurement processes in place that will control how that money is spent, right? It requires us to have a formal process of going out for bids, soliciting quotes, whatever it might be. But on the back end of that, we then say within the ordinance that the cost to the city doesn't include those federal funds because they're federal funds. They come from an outside source. So then we loop that purchase out of the procurement process, which was required to originally get those federal funds. So it creates sort of a cyclical catch-22 of logic in which we need this process to get those funds, and then we can ignore that process once we have those funds, which creates a handful of potential pitfalls and problems. And finally, and maybe the bigger portion of this, is aligning the city's use of funds with its goals. Now, before I dive into this in any fashion, it's probably important to call out Paul Goldbeck with the city manager's office, who's been key to this part of the process for sure, even to the extent that she has helped us in securing grant funding and some associations with nonprofits that are key to sort of pushing sustainability and equity concerns within public procurement generally. So we've been awarded $45,000 worth of grants, and we're working with a couple of nonprofits that offer us a great deal of expertise and knowledge within the field of how to include these sort of policies within our procurement process. So obviously the intention here is that the city has passed a lot of ordinances, created a lot of policies geared towards increasing social equity and environmental sustainability in its processes across the city, and we want to sort of enshrine that within the ordinance itself. Now, dive into the detail on this one a little bit. We're looking at doing this through two methodologies, essentially awarding points within a request for proposal procedure and allowing some flexibility in the bidding procedure for vendors that have policies that sort of cover environmental sustainability and social equity, as well as looking to adopt the state's targeted small business policies to some extent. I think the wording I have in the current draft version of the ordinance is to the extent reasonably feasible. And sort of the TSB policy that the state has first requires the organization to be located within Iowa. It has to have less than $4 million of gross revenue every year, small business. And it has to be majority owned, operated, and managed by a female, minority, or disabled individual. So it's a great policy, the state has it, and we're just looking to sort of utilize it to some extent in order to leverage what's already available out there. The state actually oversees sort of the certification process, manages the list, and we're just looking to sort of tie on to that and utilize it a little bit. So, some of the details that we're looking to get input on with the new proposed procurement ordinance are the dollar threshold at which we're coming to council. One of the things we're doing there is changing it from an annual expenditure to a look at the contract as a whole. So right now the threshold for coming to council is $50,000 of expenditure per year. What we're looking to do is switch that to $150,000 for the contract cost, essentially. Now, the current ordinance is also based 3 years for a contract, 3 years times 50,000. Essentially, we're trying to target the same idea while moving away from some of those more nonsensical situations, as I see it, like Menards, where we're not entering into a contract, we're just creating a mechanism to pay. But the general baseline for how many contracts you guys would be seeing wouldn't change outside of the blanket purchase order type idea on that front. And that would help us obviously achieve some operational flexibility, effectiveness. Obviously, we cover the controls portion. The idea there is just to make sure that we have the legal document through the ordinance that dictates the necessary legal framework for how we do purchases, but also allows us to set controls that make sense in terms of the actual professional practice of procurement. And of course, the promoting cities' equity and sustainability goals that we just covered in that last slide.
Can you explain the 50,000 to 150,000? I didn't really understand that.
Yeah. So right now, the wording is $50,000 per year in cost. So let's say
For what, sorry?
essentially any expenditure that would have to go to council.
Okay, yeah.
Yep. So essentially, let's imagine a contract that over its life is let's just say 150,000 right now, right? But it ramps up. So in any given year, let's say it starts out at 45,000, then it goes to 47.5, and then it goes to 55 and a half, or whatever my math there came out to. I'm not paying attention. The point is, the only time we would have to come to council for approval to pay on that contract right now would be that last year where it goes over that 50,000 threshold, which seems nonsensical in a lot of ways, right? So the more logical way to look at it is, well, focus on the total cost of the contract or the agreement that we're talking about up front. So then that would have to be approved at the beginning on the onset, regardless of what the staged pricing increase looks like.
Okay.
Don't our residents want us to, I mean, I think we're responsible for how we're spending our taxpayers' dollars.
Yes.
I would think I want to see what money's being spent on.
Well, I mean, there's two trains of thoughts to that as well.
No, there's really only one train of thought when it comes to people that are paying taxes.
True. So to take us back to that Menards example, for instance, right? We're already approving just the $125,000, regardless of the fact that we're spending $200,000 with Menards every year on average, right? Now, you can try to capture every single thing you're going to spend money on up front, but I would suggest that it creates a impossible burden. Now, one of the things we do, for example, every council meeting is we submit a check register, which sort of covers everything that went out the door for the past couple of weeks. And council approves that. Now that's a non-cumulative document. It's just, here's what went out the door. Alternatively, if you wanted to capture something like the Menard situation more purely, we could submit reports that sort of track cumulatively, here's where we've spent our money, here's the list of vendors, here's how much money in total we've spent with them, and here's the general overview of what that money was spent on. So right now, the process doesn't really encourage a review of everything up front, nor do I think it's reasonably possible to accomplish that. But we do submit reports on a regular basis that tell you everything we've done, and we could submit even more detailed reports that sort of could track that cumulatively and allow you to sort of see everything that's going on.
So what are you asking to change here?
Yeah,
Yeah,
next
so
step.
from what to what?
Yeah, I mean.
Because it was 50,000, right?
Yep.
Yeah, the 50 to 150,
150.
I need to understand that better, because I get the 3-year contract.
Yep.
But are you also, if there's just a 1-year contract, are we increasing that from 50 to 150 in that 1 year as well? So we're
Yes.
no longer, whereas before, if it was 50, it would come to us. Now you're proposing if it's 150, it wouldn't come to us until it's 150.
Correct, yeah, if we were going to do 1 year actual contract, it would be the 150,000 threshold as well, yes.
Right.
Well, that's a pretty massive change.
Yeah, why are we changing that?
So,
Especially when we've hired 5 more people.
three additional people, essentially, 2.5 to 5. Yeah.
But the
I
procurement
guess
of the
I don't understand
contracts.
why we're changing that, because I have concerns from going from 50 to 150 as well as I think some of the rest of us up here.
Oh, absolutely. So, one take on it, this is kind of something I just noticed yesterday. So I was out on the city's intranet site where you house our administrative manual. And within that administrative manual, there's a procurement section in there. And the policy that's in that procurement section right now was last revised in 1994. And the dollar threshold dictated in that policy from 1994 was $25,000. Subsequent to that, in 2017, I believe, we jumped to the $50,000.
50,000, I remember that.
Yep. Now, if you look at what the federal government has done, for example, in terms of how they sort of track their federal dollars and what thresholds they utilize, since 2006, they've gone from a simple acquisition threshold, which is essentially just needing to get quotes and stuff like that, of $100,000 to $250,000 to sort of give you a baseline of what inflation has done since 2006 in their eyes. Additionally, the other thought process on it was $50,000, 3 years, $150,000 for each contract. Now, obviously, that doesn't address your concerns
No, I
individually as a
mean,
single
you
year,
haven't
but
answered you kind of answered my question, but you really, I mean, you're,
I guess there would
dancing around
be,
it.
yeah, James, you're spinning here.
I'm spinning.
And-
well, there would be a difference if it was a
If I
1
could
year.
jump in
Yeah,
here at
that'd
this.
be great.
And so actually, several years ago, actually, but pre-COVID,
Yeah.
the council had asked for this to be reviewed and increased. So the question is, what is the right amount? That's what we're trying to hone in on.
Okay.
And looking at comparability of other agencies, other like-sized governments, you're seeing around this $150,000 threshold. And so then
What's the comparison group? I mean, you said.
population and probably more like the procurement amounts that they're looking at annually as far as the size of the
How much
procurement.
they buy.
But it is a decision that obviously, as council, you can make at a different level. If it's helpful, we can look at like past size of procurements and what would have fallen in or not. The other concern that I have and has been expressed at different times is the 50,000 is delaying procurements that could otherwise obviously be administratively approved. So timing is crucial as well to allow for procurement to move more.
Do you think we have to jump $100,000 more? I mean, we can't like maybe double
Like
it
75 or
to
100?
100?
You could.
And look at it, essentially you're asking us to triple it.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
No,
But
when I
what
read-
you're looking at,
Tripled it before,
for-
now we're going to triple it. Okay.
yeah.
Well,
At-
I think the whole process is important, you know, what you're talking about here. You know, I think the amount to some of us is troublesome to make that kind of leap. I like the detail you're talking about, and I'd like to understand that a little better, and I think you're doing a good job of explaining that, and the whys and the what-fors, but to also extend it to a 3-year deal, I mean, that's kind of a little,
I just wanted to point out too, it's not necessarily the tripling, because when you're looking at an agreement, they're looking at it by individual years versus the fact of the total agreement as well. So if you had an agreement that was, let's say, 4 years at 45,000, you guys would never see that, even though the total amount is over 150. In that case, that would actually get looped in and actually have to be approved by council because the overall expense to that vendor is over that 150. The type that you won't see is if it's a shorter term, larger 1 year, 2 year deal, that's where you have to do that, where we're trying to look at a more logical approach for you're setting the
But
you're-
couldn't you write those separately so that if it was 3 years and hit that 150 threshold, it would come into the policy without making a 1 year, $150,000 piece come into the policy?
Yeah, so one of the angles that we have considered is a separation between total contract value and individually significant purchases, right? So if you think about that in terms of wanting to ensure that the purchase of vehicles or something gets looped in any given year, it's just a 1-year agreement effectively, but individually, those purchases are significant in some means, right? So yes, you could separate it out to accomplish both the goal of making sure we're capturing contract cost as well as capturing individually significant purchases if we want to go down that route and see what that might look like.
Because I would look at a contract as the one purchase, not each year. So that would hit a threshold, so it would pick up, and then 1 year, having done procurement, I can't remember what our amount was, but it was, I think, more than 50. But it's good to have when you get back to other than the amount, separating and getting it rewritten, because a lot of it's procedure in this ordinance, other than just policy. So I think the initial reason for doing it, I think is good to clean it up and then to determine the amounts. And I would like to see what the other communities around, and really how many contracts would even be, or how many purchases, if you took a month's purchase, how many even be impacted by what we're talking about?
I think it would make sense to do 50,000 for 1 year, 100,000 for a 2-year contract, 150 for a 3-year, and then anything 150 and over, like we would approve. Like, beyond like the 4-year, 5-year, anything like that? Like just to set that, so that we're still
I-
getting the 50,000 for 1 year?
I think I just have the two, the amount, if it's an individual,
Yeah.
and then a multi-year.
Okay.
And I think the other thing that we're planning on doing too is to put together a list of jurisdictions just so you guys can see
Yeah,
what
kinda
the
see
other
what-
limits are as well.
Because I know that even on school board, we raised it too, and I can't remember what it is currently, but.
Yeah, and you guys just raised the municipal housing authorities limit as well, significantly. So yeah, no, it's reasonable conversation to have about right-sizing the dollar amount as well as refocusing the ordinance versus manual conversation. So next steps, obviously we're working with legal. Like I said, ordinance is a legal document. We need their sign-off eventually. Working towards a shareable draft of the procurement manual that sort of is the partner to the proposed ordinance. And then working with the departments and you guys to get feedback and sort of figure out what makes sense for everybody and how processes should be handled.
Can I ask about the third reason? You were talking about the state's guidelines for like the equity piece with procurement. And then you said like we would do that up to a certain point. And I guess I was just wondering like what that determination would be.
So the state uses the TSB program in two ways, and I might be paraphrasing to some degree. But essentially, the state allows the departments to purchase from a vendor off of the TSB listing up to $25,000 with no process.
No bidding or anything like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Now, I don't think we want to go up to the $25,000 amount, certainly not right off the onset, right? So sort of cap that at a lower amount. So that's one example of not adhering specifically to their procedures, but taking advantage of their procedures. The other side of it is they also give vendors on that TSB list I think 5-day heads up ahead of the release of any sort of bid or RFP to the general vendor population. And we don't know if it would make sense to utilize that portion of their program or not. So the idea is that within the scope of the TSB program that the state has, we could eventually utilize the full extent of it, but sort of roll that out with what everybody is comfortable with and what makes sense, given our organization is obviously smaller than the state's overall population.
And you said that wouldn't apply to public improvements. Would it apply to like federal grant money or anything like that?
Probably not. So right now, the way the ordinance is, the proposed ordinance is written is that it sort of, if the rules that of the TSB program would essentially violate the requirements of the federal grant, we wouldn't apply it, right? So essentially, federal grants restrictions take precedence, and then it falls.
But in the absence of restrictions, we would be able to apply it?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Any other quick questions?
There were a couple of pieces in there on the matching principles. There was the buy local.
Yes.
I mean, I'd be interested in both, well, in the targeted small business, in the local preference, and in the sustainability piece being on the more aggressive side, I guess, on all of those pieces. And I liked, and maybe I need to understand it better, but if we have the ability to give a local contractor or a targeted small business, I didn't see this in the targeted small business, the opportunity to match the lowest bid, I like that. I like that option from a procurement perspective because I think that helps us accomplish other objectives.
Yep.
So that piece, at least as I read it, and I'd welcome additional information, but I welcome being more aggressive on that piece.
I was going to say Iowa City does something similar to that.
Well, and we only did like a 1% preference, and Nick, I think in the email you sent me, Iowa City has a up to 10% preference, right?
Cedar Rapids, yeah.
Cedar Rapids does.
So I would rather there, because the 1%, you're only going to, I mean, you're not going to get a lot of bids, but 10%, you're probably going to capture a decent number, and it's going to actually be impactful for the local,
Yeah,
if they choose to match.
It's a sliding scope, so it's up to 25,000. is the 10%, and then it goes to 5, and then it goes to 1.
Yep.
And so it's scalable. It's 10% for less than 25,000 in Cedar Rapids, and 5% for those that are less than 200,000, and 1% for anything over 200,000.
I'm not clear what the percents are.
For the local preference.
Percent of, so if it's
get
a
points.
$25,000
Right.
bid,
Pushers.
like, and the difference is in 10%, that'd be 2,500. But why, I mean, if it's 1% for 200,000, you'd only get $2,000. Like, I mean, essentially, it's almost a moot point in the larger.
It's 5% up to 200,000.
Okay.
And so that's, thanks.
But is that something where we have more flexibility? Like, could we do 10% at the, up to 200,000?
While we're working on the ordinance, that's other, we could look at that.
I don't think it's on.
Yeah.
It's not on.
It says it's on.
Oh.
At that point, we have to just be careful. Well, at all points, we have to be careful, but high percentage, high dollar is a budgetary issue as well. And so we would need to make sure we're budgeting for potentially more.
Well, no, but it's not a, I thought the way, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, I thought the way it worked is what we then do is we give the local the opportunity to match the best price. Like,
Oh,
they-
on that
yeah.
piece, yes.
Right, so they weren't necessarily at the best price, but we can do that without,
We're saying if they're within 10% of the price?
10%.
right, if they're within
Yep.
10% of the
No
price.
matter what the cost of the.
And they're based inside the city corporately.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
then they have the ability to come back and match it. We're not paying anything more. We're preferencing the local and
Who we
giving,
deal with.
giving them a chance. And they might look at that and say, no, we can't match that price. We're not going to do it. But that preference is the local business.
Now I understand what you're saying.
So I don't think there's a cost implication, right? It's just a policy.
Not for the bids portion, correct. The request for proposal portion is more of a points allocation situation. So essentially what we'd be doing there is allocating some number of the total points to a local business. So it's potential that that could weight the overall scoring of that RFP towards them, even if their price is a little bit more. But, I mean, that's a consideration that can be separated out as well.
And you could have different standards for the
Yep.
bid process where they can match versus.
the
RFP.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's what I was going to ask about the point award.
Yeah, we currently, in the proposed ordinance, did separate them out as it sits today, yeah.
Well, it's so, I mean, at least from my perspective, I certainly on the bid and the ability for our local folks to match a bid, I definitely have, I'd like us to be more aggressive there.
I agree with that.
And I mean, if
And
it sounds like there's.
The RFP is, I guess I'm open to further conversation and understanding that better.
Yeah, on that topic, I mean, it sounds like there's interest in more detail, so, I mean, we can easily come back with numbers and specifics and get really into the weeds on this in a conversation in the future.
I'd also like a little bit more clarity on like what we're splitting off into ordinance and policy and
Yep.
procedure.
So the next step, obviously, is getting a shareable draft of that procurement manual.
Okay.
So it'll give you like specific details of everything that's going to be over in the manual, and I'll provide a red line with the current ordinance versus the proposed ordinance, so,
Awesome.
yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was just the first draft of
Yep.
what we were working on. We took it from a rework process instead of the red line, and we're going to rework it that way so we can kind of put comments into what's moving to the manual versus what's staying within the ordinance.
And to clarify on that other point that was pointed out here, it's not if the local preference within 10% or whatever that they could match. It's
Yep.
not that we're going to pay 10% more.
Yeah,
Yep.
still protecting tax dollars, but giving opportunity to local businesses as best we can.
Okay.
If they have the same qualifications.
Yeah, exactly. They'll meet the
Okay.
responsible bidder threshold and everything.
Any other questions?
I think I need some clarification on what counts as public improvements and what, like, which bidding processes would this affect, I guess?
Yeah, and obviously, public improvements are sort of handled by the engineering
Right.
department, and the state has specific definition of what qualifies in there. But essentially, what you can think of it as is everything from bridges and roadways to public buildings.
So on our bidding process, we still have a lowest responsible bidder, but it's just not defined by the state, or?
Yeah, no, the state's rules around regular procurements outside of public improvements are few and
Okay.
far between.
So we have more
currently.
control there.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right, excellent.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks for your time.
Scott, unless there's anything else?
No, I appreciate the input. This will give us, on both topics, an opportunity to get more detail to you.
Any legal pre-meeting this evening? Nothing? All right, so we'll see everybody.
Yeah.
Yep. But we got no legal issues. So see everybody 4:45, meeting's adjourned, thank you.